Uzķēršam, preparējam, aizšujam. Tāda ir Mediju Anatomija.
Rietumu iedomās, krievu tauta ir ķīlnieki, ko sagrāvis diktators, kas ir ieinteresēts tikai paša varā un peļņā. Putins valda pār 145 miljoniem cilvēku, kurus ieslēdzis būrī, kas aizmetināts ar propagandu un represijām. Tomēr vairāku gadu garumā ziņojot par notikumiem Krievijā, es satiku parastus krievus, kuri neuzrādīja nekādas pazīmes, ka būtu turēti tur pret savu gribu. Tā žurnālists Džošua Jaffa raksta savā grāmatā Starp divām ugunīm patiesība, ambīcijas un kompromisi Putina Krievijā, tā cenšoties caur dažādu cilvēku dzīves gājuma aprakstiem parādīt Krievijas morāles dilemmas. Kopš Krievijas pilna mēroga iebrukuma Ukrainā Džošua Jaffa turpina rakstīt par notikumiem Krievijā, taču vairs ne no Maskavas. Šonedēļ Mediju Anatomiju veidoja es, Zane Ozoliņa, un mans sarunas biedrs ir Džošua Jaffa, amerikāņu žurnāla The NewYorker žurnālists ar 10 gadu pieredzi ziņojot no Maskavas.
These days I'm based in Berlin. I still write about Russia. I report about and from Ukraine. Of course, like many of my colleagues, foreign correspondents who lived in Moscow, our work is the same but different. We try to understand what is happening in Russian society, politics, all the ways that Russia has changed as a result of the war, but we have to do this remotely, which of course is imperfect, frustrating, still possible actually, using some pre-existing contacts, trying to develop new ones, very sensitive about the safety of sources, anonymity, and so on. And so, while of course it's not the ideal form to do journalism, it's not the journalism that I like doing the most. I much prefer having this human, in-person, face-to-face contact. But still, understanding what is happening inside of Russia feels super important and is also very interesting to me personally. And so we do what we can.
You are also covering Ukraine and have written several feature stories. For me, one of the remarkable is the story about collaborators. How do you find your sources and storylines in Ukraine?
The thing about Ukraine, perhaps any war zone, but I haven't reported from others, is that there are just stories, there are dramatic fates, lives turned upside down, people facing incredible dilemmas, hardship, trauma. It's everywhere, which is the great tragedy of Ukraine, right? This is a country undergoing an incredible ongoing trauma. But that also means that life is lived at the extremes in so many places across Ukraine and for so many people. And so you don't really have to try all that hard to identify some particularly unique or gripping stories that feel urgent and I think grab reader attention. They're happening all over the place. That's especially true at the beginning of the war. As time goes on, of course, it becomes more difficult to find new stories, new themes, topics that feel like they aren't repeating themselves. The stories of Russian destruction, atrocities, and so on. Of course, this continues, but it's harder and harder to present this as something new to grab attention in the way we could in, say, 2022. But again, that's the work of a journalist, to find new dynamics, new topics to document in the context of Ukraine, the way that Ukrainian society is changing as a result of the war. It's no longer the same country it was 2 years ago, and it's interesting to try and report about this and to bring this to American readers. And so there too the work evolves, but in any case, whether it's trying to report about Russia from outside, inside Ukraine, I mean, this is the work of a journalist to adapt to and to kind of take as a reality whatever difficult circumstances there may be and still try and work within them to get true stories, important stories with an emotional connection for readers. All of this is still possible.
Do you think the work of Ukrainian journalists, of the Baltic journalists reporting about Ukraine, and of you as a New Yorker journalists differ? Because, for example, our Latvian journalists sometimes also take some some help with them or some donations and help Ukraine. And you mentioned in this panel discussion that it is not my responsibility, not my job to help Ukraine win. It's a different kind of, like, you cannot tie it. But here in Latvian, it is more tied together.
I have no problem with that, and certainly I have incredible respect and admiration for Ukrainian colleagues, many of whom I'm lucky to consider friends, who are Ukrainian journalists who perform their job with real bravery, not the kind of, fake bravery that sometimes people try and ascribe to myself or other foreign correspondents. I mean, these are people who are really risking on a daily basis themselves and their comfort, their families, and so on to do this work, while themselves having to navigate life in a war zone. So I'm incredibly impressed by Ukrainian colleagues who deserve all of our admiration. But it's only natural that, obviously, Ukrainian journalists report on the war very differently than American journalists. That's fine. That's correct. I mean, it would be strange if it was not the case. For Baltic journalists, too, given history, geography, security interests, totally fine, normal, okay. That Baltic journalists have a different sense of attachment to the story in Ukraine than I do. I have no problem with that. I mean, I'm not a journalist ethics professor in any case, so who cares what I think, actually? It's not my job to issue judgment on how other journalists do their job. I can only speak for myself and repeat what I said earlier today, which is, as a professional, and that's what I do. I practice a profession, a craft of journalism. I don't have an attachment to a specific outcome. That's not my job. It's not my job to try and create a specific outcome in Ukraine. It's my job to report even uncomfortable or discouraging, depressing truths about reality that maybe I myself or my readers are uncomfortable with. But still, it's the job of a journalist to look in uncomfortable places, to be ready to face those uncomfortable truths, to tell them to readers, and to kind of follow the story wherever it goes, not to try and become the story or affect the story.
Our colleagues have mentioned also the guidelines, sort of guidelines from Ukrainian military, which have to be followed if you want to work for a longer time in Ukraine. Do you feel some kind of, I don't know if censorship is the real word while working there?
As the war has gone on, it's become more bureaucratized on the Ukrainian side. This is to be expected. Of course, the early days of the war were total chaos in Ukrainian society. The Ukrainian military specifically was busy with defending the very survival of the Ukrainian state in those early days. So no one had the time to think about what kind of proper accreditation system should there be for journalists. So you had more of a kind of free-ranging situation. Over time, military has become more bureaucratized, as I mentioned. The accreditation system has become more formalized. And yes, there are many more limitations on where you're allowed to go, how freely you can travel, especially anything concerning military activity, spending times with troops on the front line. There is a lot of control from military and political leadership in Ukraine about the degree to which you can move unencumbered and report freely, and that's creates difficulties and frustrations for journalists. That's true, but at the same time, like I mentioned in a previous answer, this is the reality with which we have to work. It's not my job or role to come up with a accreditation policy for the Ukrainian military. I can be frustrated by it. I can find it limiting, annoying. That's my role. That's my kind of responsibility, and to try and work within those limitations. Yes, we don't have the kind of free-ranging ability to work everywhere and in the way we like without some controls or impediments the way it was at the beginning of the war, but this is the reality of the war in 2024, and so we, as journalists, need to learn to work within this new reality also.
The new reality is also that from Berlin, you have to report and tell stories and analyze what's happening in Russia. How is it possible? What are your sources? How do you understand what people are thinking, what is going on there in 2 years after the war?
Well, thankfully, I have a great basis of knowledge of Russia from before. I lived there for 10 years. That would be a very difficult job to do if you were becoming a Russia correspondent, but doing that job from the beginning in exile or outside of Russia. That would be difficult. But I have this body of knowledge, experience, contacts from 10 years. I think I understand certain themes or aspects of Russian society, politics, how people relate to political events. So I have this pre-existing body of knowledge, also have, as I mentioned, pre-existing contacts, people who I know personally, and so it's easier to take with you these contacts and relationships you already had. Of course, it's harder to create new relationships. I mean, that's what I was doing all the time when I lived in Russia, always meeting new people, expanding my circle, not just of sources, but acquaintances, contacts. And this is more difficult to do from outside. But over those 10 years, I met enough people, not all of whom, of course, but some I'm able to still be in touch with. But also, as I mentioned, I have a kind of analytic frame or context for understanding Russia that I think still helps me and still holds true even in this new era of Russia at wartime. I think the way that I came to understand, how Russian society, politics, and so on functions, some of that knowledge is still applicable in this current moment.
About covering Ukrainian war, we have mentioned before, also some journalists from BBC and Sunday Times, for example, are discussing that it is really hard to work because you cannot get to the other side, you cannot get the whole picture. How do you feel? And Ukrainian journalists on the other side also repeat the truth that you cannot align facts with lies. How can we get out of this dilemma?
Don't think, or rather, this idea of balance is a false one. And it's not that we need to, balance a bit of truth and then, add in a bit of lies to get a kind of, quote unquote, objective or balanced picture. Or let's say it's the job of a journalist is not to take quality information and then for balance find some, low quality information and create something that, somehow is supposed to be fair. That's not the job of a journalist. The job of a journalist is to find true, accurate, honest, quality information and portray that to the reader. That said, if we could do that from the other side, as you mentioned, from the Russia side, that feels really important to me. In fact, I try to do that in my reporting from Russia to understand what everyday Russians are thinking, what Russian members of the Russian elite are thinking, business, political elite. I would love, as a reader, to read a very detailed, honest report from inside, for example, a Russian military unit. What do they think? What do they say to each other? How do their commanders treat them? The problem is, given the degree of authoritarian control in Russia, this is just, so unlikely as to be almost laughable. The idea that an independent, especially foreign journalist would be let inside a Russian military unit to write this really honest piece of reportage. Like, for example, my colleagues at the NewYorker have written similarly honest, raw, in many ways uncomfortable pieces from inside Ukrainian military units talking about the kind of ground truth of the war for those fighting it on the Ukrainian side. As a reader, I would be very interested to read such a piece from a Russian military unit. But for the reasons I mentioned, that's just seems so unrealistic as to be absurd given the extent to which Russia has become, already an authoritarian country, has accelerated in that process so much since the war began.
I remember in the introduction part in your book, you mentioned that people from outside, from West, look at Russia as this cage where Putin is keeping all the hostages, Russian people as hostages, but they don't feel like that. How do you think? Is it changed now? Has it changed now? Or they don't feel trapped even 2 years in this war?
Of course, it's changed. The war has reset, in some ways reset Russian society, in other ways accelerated other processes that began before, made more dramatic some kind of features of Russian society or relations between people in the state that already existed. So it's scrambled society, intensified it. So it's different for different people. If you look at the polling data, and of course, surveys done in a context of effective wartime dictatorship are complicated to understand what we should make of them. But still, you see that there is 10 to 15% of the population that is quite enthusiastic of the war, thinks Russia should pursue maximalist aims, bomb Kiev, that sort of thing. And there's about 10 or 15% of people who are opposed to the war, who think it's terrible, immoral, and must be stopped as soon as possible. And so that leaves 80%, 70% of the Russian public somewhere in between. And it's that status or that condition of being in between that I describe in my book. People who try to avoid not just politics, but really thinking of themselves as political actors, as political subjects. That's not a comfortable or familiar position for them to be in. They try to avoid this topic, avoid thinking about it, certainly avoid taking a kind of moral or political responsibility for it. And so in that sense, the dynamic that I describe in the book continues in more intensified and pressurized form. But that said, lots of people have had to make compromises, or rather decisions, about what they're willing to tolerate, how loyal they're willing to be, and so on, that are far more dramatic than the kind I describe in my book, and sort of put them outside of this kind of moral gray zone that I describe in the book, and really put them closer to something like a black or white position when they're forced to choose once and for all. Where are they going to cast their chips, as it were? So it's different for different people, but on the whole, I would say the war has intensified and deepened the dynamics and processes I write about, rather than fundamentally changed or canceled them.
And do you have a feeling that this assumption of not that facts don't matter, but matters how you look at them, do you think it also has intensified?
What I think has intensified is the feeling that individuals are powerless, that politics, certainly matters of war and peace, is something that happens on a higher plane, and that individual people don't have any chance to affect such events, and therefore it would be something like not just dangerous, but even foolish to try. There's a Russian political philosopher whose work I really admire, I think is very smart, Greg Yudin. And Greg Yudin once described this condition to me as imagining that a terrible rainstorm begins outside the window. What is your response? It would not just be wrong and inefficient, but actually make you look somewhat crazy if you were to think you could somehow stop the rain, do a rain dance, argue with the gods. There's nothing you can do to stop the rain. The best thing you can do is to try and find an umbrella. And I think that describes the Russian condition very well, including in wartime, that somehow stopping the war is equivalent to, or really affecting any big decision of Putin's or the Kremlin, is akin to thinking you can do a rain dance to stop the rain. The only thing left for you is to try and protect yourself, your family, and so on. And I think that is the act of survival, of navigating a reality over which you feel like you have very little control, is what Russians are engaged in.
We really tend to look at Russia in black and white terms. How did you become interested in this, what you called moral gray zone?
Because I lived in Russia for many years, and I began to see that the Russia that I was writing about, along with other colleagues in foreign press corps, was not, I was not entirely capturing the whole or true essence of the Russian experience in articles that focused either on the one hand in brave, heroic opposition leaders, people like Alexei Navalny, who deserve admiration, attention, and all the rest. Or on the other hand, corrupt, sadistic autocrats, Putin or the others like him in that system. That neither of those poles actually captures the existence or lives of most Russians. Most Russians are trying to navigate lives somewhere in between. And that is the condition that I saw all around me, felt like wasn't getting enough coverage or attention, and wanted to capture myself.
Question about the title Between Two Fires. How would you translate it in Russian?
Между двух огней. It's a Russian expression. The title comes from the Russian expression между двух огней, which means literally exactly that, between two fires. And it's essentially about the condition of being trapped between two forces, larger than yourself, having no good choices, trying just to navigate a path of adaptation and survival for yourself.
Could you tell a little bit about the process of fact-checking in the New Yorker? How did they manage to check your wartime stories from Ukraine or the stories from Russia, especially now when you have to sometimes use anonymous sources or protect your sources?
The New Yorker is rightly famous for its fact-checking department, which is the subject of a lot of articles, media attention in and of itself, all of it very well deserved. It's an institution inside a larger institution. And my articles, whether about Russia, from Ukraine, are fact-checked very similar to every other article of the New Yorker. There's not a separate process really for what I write. But what this entails is that fact-checkers working in this separate fact-checking department go back through all of my material, all of my notes, recordings. They speak with sources, even with anonymous sources. There's a great tradition and practice at the New Yorker. People know how to do this to keep sources safe. And they make sure, first and foremost, that everything is accurate. I mean, everything is correct, true. That's the goal here. And having this stage, this additional step, which doesn't take hours, but days, if not sometimes weeks, to get right. Just the fact checking is to go back over all the material, to have a fresh set of eyes do this, and to make sure that, largely just out of pure accident, right? No one, neither myself certainly, nor the people I'm interviewing are purposely, most of the time, trying to insert falsehoods or mistakes into the text. It's just human nature. People misremember things, get dates wrong, get flustered during an interview and say the wrong thing. And what we're really interested in is making sure that everything maximally reflects the truth. It's not an opportunity to make yourself sound smarter, more eloquent, and so on. What we're interested in is the truth. Every time, of course, there can be a bit of stress involved, but really it's a very well-oiled machine that knows how to do its job well.
The last question about your friend Ivan, who is still in jail in Russia for doing reporting in Russia. How do you think, why would Russia shoot with the large bullets on journalists, which is something unprecedented, jailing American journalists for doing his job?
Evan is a hostage. Evan is also a very good friend of mine, and I'm glad you asked about his case because it's important to talk about Evan in any context and forum I can. He's now spent more than a year in Russian jail, accused of crimes of espionage that are so silly as to barely merit discussion. He is there as a pawn, as a hostage, and the Kremlin did this on purpose. This is not an accident that Evan is in jail, and he was doing exactly the same kind of journalistic work that all of us do, all of his friends and colleagues who were foreign correspondents working in Moscow over the years. And so in many ways I feel a great debt to Evan that he is in jail for doing the work that we all do. He's there for all of us, in other words. And that's a great burden and also a responsibility to keep Evan front of mind in my own life and work, and to also make sure that at opportunities like this one, when I have to speak to a wider public, that they know about Evan and the fact that there is an innocent and totally professional journalist who was just doing his job, and for that reason and that reason alone has now spent more than a year in Russian jail.
Evans Gerškovičs ir The Wall Street Journal žurnālists, kurš kopš pagājušā gada marta apsūdzēts par spiegošanu un atrodas Krievijas cietumā. Ja viņš tiktu notiesāts, žurnālistam draud 20 gadi Krievijas kolonijā. Šonedēļ Mediju Anatomijā dzirdējāt sarunu ar NewYorker žurnālistu Džošua Jaffa. Raidījumu veidoja Zane Ozoliņa un Reinis Budze.
Uzķēršam, preparējam, aizšujam. Tāda ir Mediju Anatomija.